Good morning, everyone. It's very glad to see you this morning. As scary as it might seem, it is June. Sorry. But as we start June and we kind of shift into the summer, I was looking ahead at some of the gospel lessons we have, and we are tracking the Gospel of Mark now for a number of weeks. And so my intention is to do at least 3 weeks of a look at Mark and kind of turning around what Mark would have us want to know about who Jesus was and what Jesus is calling us into as disciples today. Now, just as an aside, if it's been a while since you've done a Bible study, or perhaps it's been a while since you've read the Bible and you're interested in doing something about that, Mark is a great place to start. Mark is a short little gospel. It wouldn't take you more than about an hour to read it. And so perhaps as an invitation as you start the summer months, you might take an hour sometime this week and read the entire Gospel of Mark front to back. Who knows, it could inspire you to do a little bit more over the summer as you start and shift a new rhythm. So Mark's Gospel, as we heard today, starts and wastes no time. Mark does not waste any words. He uses every word very intentionally. If we consider just the very first chapter of Mark, Jesus is baptized. He is tempted in the wilderness. He goes off and he calls some disciples. He heals a man with an unclean spirit. Then, yes, I know, unclean. Then he goes about, he heals Simon Peter's mother-in-law. Then he goes and he heals more unclean spirits. He heals various other diseases. He goes on a preaching tour of Galilee, and then he finally heals a man with leprosy, and that is just the first chapter. And so Mark rushes right into all the different kind of work that Jesus does. And so by the time we get to chapter 2, which is what we heard today, Jesus has already drawn a lot of attention. And it's the kind of attention that the disciples may not like so much. Because what's happening is Jesus is taking what the world says is most important. Jesus is taking the rules of the world and he's kind of flipping them on their head. And we see that very specifically in today's gospel. Now, before we get there, we heard from Deuteronomy that the Sabbath is very holy and that we're to keep the Sabbath. See, over the course of the development of Judaism, there were lots and lots of rules put in place, not for the sake of rules at first, but because the people wanted to make sure that we stayed close to God. There are many, many ways that we as humans can get off the rails. And so little rules were added over time to try and shore up the boundaries that kind of keep us on the rails. Well, fast forward hundreds of years, and there are literally thousands of rules that were to be kept in order to stay close and to stay faithful to God. On the scene comes Jesus. And he's quite aware that the rules have become a bit more important than what the rules were supposed to do, which was to help us stay close to God. And so in this second chapter, the story we heard today, Jesus is walking around with his disciples, and they're hungry. They've just been walking for days. And so they pass a field of grain, even on the Sabbath, and Jesus says, pluck some grain and eat, because you're hungry. So they do. And the leaders, the Pharisees, see what he does, and they start to get angsty. And then Jesus goes into the synagogue, because it is the Sabbath, and he sees a man with a withered hand, and he heals the man's hand, and the leaders just lose their mind because Jesus is not following the rules. He claims to be a rabbi, and he's calling disciples around him, and he's not following the rules. And then Jesus says something that's really important for us. Jesus says the Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. And that's a really important distinction for us to make, not just as a Bible study fan, but as a 21st century person trying to live the life that God made us to live. You see, Jesus understands very clearly that rules were made for us to help us be the kind of people that God made us to be, not the other way around. But you see, we really like rules. I think most of us really like having rules and expectations clearly defined so that we're able to work through life, move through the social order, succeed in ways that the world tells us is important, and to do so by navigating the systems of the world. Those rules are often rules that we use to our advantage to kind of build the life and security and comfort that we really like. Rules are good so long as they don't become the point of our life. Rules are good so long as they help us to be the kind of people that we want to be. But you see, we live in the world, and the world has lots and lots of rules. And how are we to process which rules are most important and perhaps which rules are not? And as I was thinking about this idea, I recalled a story that I had read a few weeks ago, written by a man named John, about an experience he had with his very young daughter while they were walking out in the woods. See, John was out in the woods with his young daughter and their dog, and they had kind of gotten away from a lot of people, and so he took the dog off the leash. She did not like that. So, as John takes their dog Ruby off the leash, the little girl precociously says, "Dad, the sign says," and she pointed to the sign, "dogs must remain leashed at all times." And he writes that her tone was more of an admonition than it was a statement of fact. And he says, "Honey, there's no one else around, and Ruby, their dog, needs to learn how to behave when she's off the leash too. I think it'll be okay." And he writes that he saw her perplexed face because he and his wife constantly stressed to both of their children just how important rules were and the consequences of breaking those rules. And so as he was watching her process perhaps which rules can and cannot be broken, he recalled that in those same woods, when he was in college, he would go down to the lake and they would swim in the lake, even though right at the shore of the lake was a nice big sign that said "no swimming." And at one point, as he was drying off, having obviously swum in the lake, he was approached by a park ranger, and the ranger came up and said, "You're not allowed to swim." And he said, "Well, then give me a fine if you want to. But people have been swimming in this lake for hundreds of years, and they're going to be swimming in this lake for hundreds of years, and so I'll pay it just to swim here." And the park ranger did not give him a ticket. But as he was thinking through this, he realized that raising children changes a lot about what we perceive around rules. He writes, "I'd certainly warn my children of the dangers of doing things like swimming without an adult present. And breaking the law is different from breaking the rules. And I want my kids to grow up to be independent thinkers and not convicted felons." Of course, most of us break rules every day. Ever drive over the speed limit? Or bring your own snacks to the movie theater? And most of us would not hesitate to break the law if circumstances demanded them, like smashing through a window or a door if there were a fire in order to escape. But is it possible to set a good example for our children while defying rules or laws you do not believe in? Some say it, as long as you involve your children in thinking through the moral dilemmas, then they can actually process well. He writes finally that you can never prepare your child for every decision they are going to face. In the end, the best any parent can do is instill in their children strong values and hope for the best. Instilling values is really what's happening in today's gospel lesson. And those kinds of values is really what God is calling us into ourselves. Those rules can certainly be helpful. The Pharisees knew so. Judaism has created all of these wonderful rules to try and keep people moving toward God. But when the rules became so complicated and so difficult to maintain, and there were people whose professional lives were all about interpreting and maintaining the rules, then Jesus realized that the rules had gotten in the way. Just like today, there are lots and lots of rules out in the world that tell us who we are to be and what we are to do and what we are not to do. And yet Jesus calls us in our discipleship anyway. There are rules, whether they are laws or not, that dictate how we behave with one another, what we are owed, what is ours, what we own, and how we are to use those things. And yet Jesus calls us to do what? To love God and to love our neighbor. Jesus doesn't put a lot more rules around that idea because for him, the point is the relationships we have with one another and the relationships we have with God. When we choose to hide behind rules of decorum or polite society or other kinds of structures that keep us comfortable, we're actually choosing comfort over love. Jesus pokes at us and calls us today. Jesus wants us to challenge the ideas that we like so very much because those rules that we like, that keep us comfortable, often don't push us to become uncomfortable enough to change and to grow. This summer, as we shift our rhythms and we shift the way that we are with one another and perhaps even where we physically are around the city or the world, I invite you to consider opening yourself up and allowing God to challenge you, to push you, and to grow and to stretch so that the Spirit can help to transform you. Allow yourself to be uncomfortable with how comfortable you are. Allow God to invite you into pushing away some of the boundaries that the world puts around us that ultimately will keep us from living the kind of discipleship that God calls us into. Here at St. Michael, we really try to commit to doing a few things together, to pray together, to learn together, to serve together, to give together. We try to break some of the molds that the world puts us in, because it's only when we break some of those molds that God's Spirit can get down deep into our soul. Don't allow the world's rules to keep God's law out. Don't allow what you think is most important based on whatever the world has taught us to keep us from actually loving one another and loving God fully. Mark tells a story of Jesus that rushes to the point that love is strongest, that love is all that we actually need, and that love is what we are called to give one another. And so this summer, start a little journey for yourself that will help open you up, to crack yourself open and let a little of the God's Spirit in so that we can be transformed by love and then transform the world. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for the gift of love, and we ask that you help us with courage to allow your Spirit to transform us so that love is what we have and love is what we give to every person. Amen.